Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so in this video, I'd like to talk a little bit more about JODI HILDEBRANDT, okay? Specifically about a recent video that I saw that actually kind of surprised me. I saw a video of JODI HILDEBRANDT where she's trying to make the distinction between a person who operates out of, let's say, righteous anger, where their anger is out of just truth and not distortion. And basically she uses this distinction to try to explain how she is not on the side of, like, say, being abusive. Okay. And basically she somehow believes that if your anger can come out of, like, say, a pure place, a place that is not in distortion, at that point, then you're not going to commit the sin of, like, over dominating, let's say, your children, or let's say just being oppressive with people, or making your children, let's say, just obey you just because they're afraid of you or whatever. And somehow she feels that if you can just sort of like get on the side where you don't have any distortion, then your anger becomes, I guess, like, not abusive, basically. Um, a couple of things surprised me about these comments, this interview that I saw with JODI HILDEBRANDT. One of the things that surprised me was that it seemed like she was aware. She has awareness, and it's interesting. Whenever you get to with people who have, let's say, personality disorders, a lot of times they are really aware of what abuse is, and they are aware that when you're excessive, you can actually take away someone's autonomy, and it's almost like they have an awareness of what abuse is, but somehow they don't see themselves as crossing lines when actually they are crossing lines. Okay, so it's kind of interesting how the subjective element, when you're in a personality disorder, you sometimes believe you're being reasonable. And only, like, say, with hindsight or with a special insight could you actually later on see that when you think you're being reasonable, sometimes you're actually not being reasonable. So um, I thought this was a really interesting. I think it was an interview, or she was just talking about, kind of making the difference between anger that's abusive and anger that's not abusive, basically. And essentially she was acknowledging that, if you're let's say, if you're too dominant, and if you're just too oppressive with your children, basically you can just turn your children into robots where they're not obeying you because they're sharing, like, a vision of what the truth is, but they're just obeying you just because they don't want to be punished, or they're just afraid of you. Basically, you're just turning your children into robots. And it's interesting that she said that, because I do think, honestly, I do think one thing I see in the Mormon culture, basically, um, I do see a problem where there is kind of an excessive emphasis on sort of getting with the program and sort of almost like adapting to, like, the culture. And I think that from a young age, I think, both families and children, there's kind of this idea of assimilation, okay, where you just become almost like, I guess, through peer pressure, or it's just the environment, where basically it's sort of understood that you just have to become a perfect Mormon, basically. And, whether that's by oppression or by intimidation or just peer pressure or just by example, I think the culture does suffer, I believe, from an excessive kind of oppression, where basically it really infects people with an excessive need to sort of assimilate and sort of be like the ideal Mormon. And of course, in different families, that's going to look different. In some families, it's just going to be by good example. It's not going to be through anger or through punishment. But basically, the environment is one where there's a staggering kind of impressive level of assimilation, where people become really assimilated. It's a very effective I think it's a very effective culture, in the sense that somehow they've developed these almost utopian ideals, where there are so many people who become really these almost like ideal, sunshiny, perfect Mormons, and they're kind of good looking, and they're very personable and very nice, and it's almost kind of like irresistible, I guess, for people who catch that. Um, but I guess the dark side of Mormonism is that, because Mormonism is so used to such a high level of assimilation, okay, and because I guess the Mormon culture is so accustomed to having such a high degree of performance, and I guess, because I guess the standard is so high, basically, because it's such an effective culture. then, I guess you're going to find people like Jodi Hildebrandt and like Ruby Franke who, when they do have, let's say, situations where they're having difficulty raising their children or whatever, the pressure to be a perfect Mormon, is so strong that I think, the part that's going to collapse in that structure is going to be maybe, some kind of sense of restraint or humanity with your children. And so, like, the weakest link basically is, how, I guess in some cases, is how we treat our children, and I guess the church is so powerful and the expectations are so powerful that I think if there's any, if somebody does have a sense that my family is not living up to the standard, if anybody's going to, if it's going to be, if anger is going to be taken out on anybody, it's going to be on the weakest people, which is the young children, So I think the whole dynamic and the whole, I guess, architecture of the Mormon culture, I guess, obviously the weakest link is going to be in some families, I guess, the children, the weakest people. And so I think the whole framework does, I think, pose a risk of abuse, at least, at the margins. It poses a risk of abuse, I think, to young people, children. Obviously, the average family is not going to behave like that, because I think most Mormons, I think the power of their example, I should say the power of their authority is really through their example. And I think most Mormons just kind of stubbornly and kind of like relentlessly, they just kind of overpower you with their good example, I think. And I don't think anger is the typical device that shows up in most Mormon families. So I do think that they almost kill you with the niceness. It's like they smother you with the wonderfulness of it. So I don't know which is worth. I don't know if I'd rather be murdered by being smothered by a blanket of niceness, or I'd rather just somebody just come out and just hit me in the face. I kind of wonder which is, maybe it's almost more authentic just to be outright abusive. But in any case, I found it interesting that that Jodi Hildebrandt kind of acknowledges that there are ways to go too far, and I think she does acknowledge, that there are ways that you can be with your children where you just oppress them so much that basically the children are left without their own sense of their own self, and basically they're not behaving properly just because they agree with the parents. They're behaving properly because they're afraid of the parents, and they just don't want to be in trouble, basically. So you're just kind of like dominating them into submission. So it's interesting that she can see that, and it's also interesting that she somehow believes that if you can just have, let's say, anger without distortion, that then that's going to be effective, And I think that's an interesting concept. And, to be quite honest, I think on some abstract level, I think I kind of agree, I guess, with her. I guess, we should all strive not to have, let's say, contaminated, distorted reactions. But I think, I guess on some abstract level, but I think if we cannot agree on what truth is, okay, then that's going to be a problem. Because I think the problem that I see with Jodi Hildebrandt and Ruby Franke also is that, on some high abstract level, their ideas might make sense, but the problem is that what do they mean by truth? Okay, what do they mean by truth? And I think if I had to come up with anything that I've seen in the pop culture that's even remotely similar to what I see with their vision of the truth, let's say, Jodi Hildebrandt's vision of the truth, it's interesting. It's very similar to what I saw with Ayn Rand. When I was younger, I read these objectivist books by Ayn Rand. She was basically kind of a libertarian who wrote books like, say, in the 1940s. I'm going to say the 1940s. I don't know, technically maybe her first book was written like in the 1930s, but basically let's just say the 1940s. Okay. And she wrote a book called The Fountainhead and a book called Atlas Shrugged. And basically these were not very artistic novels. They were just basically just a thin vehicle to just kind of display her philosophy, which is this kind of philosophy of radical objectivism, that basically it's like a belief. It's really, I think Ayn Rand, we could say she had kind of an ideology. It's like a belief. It's almost like a religion where she believed. It was just belief. She didn't actually prove it. She never proved it because you can't prove it. But she basically she just kind of announced. She just kind of, it's almost like she just sort of declared that it's as a matter of policy. Like, as a matter of policy, we ought to believe that our objective, let's say, our objective relation to the world is absolutely true. Okay. In other words, basically, she just took the position that how a human views their surroundings and interacts with their surroundings is absolutely perfectly true. So that when you see something, it is what it is. Now, I think to some degree that is healthy, because I think some people do actually distort their sort of their basic objective position in the world. Some people just have this almost excessive, like, I think some people do have an excessive there's so I guess, well, hold on. I think people tend to have so much complication and denial because they don't really want to face things. So when you look at it that way, like, say, especially with personality disorders, there are a lot of things in the world that I don't really want to face. So I don't really accept them. You know what I mean? So in that sense, there is like a layer of denial, a layer of complication, because maybe we don't really want to face just the cold realities of the world. So now that, to me, that doesn't prove that my position as an objective person is absolutely true. Okay. That just says that there are layers, I think, sometimes where we put on, like, say, complication and denial and avoidance, and we don't really want to deal with all the realities around us. Okay. So in that sense, I think I understand the policy, okay, of just taking straight up the cold drink of water. Just take the reality around us as it is and don't complicate it. Now that I understand. But to go further and to say that my objective position in the world, okay, is absolutely true, I don't think that's a good policy. And I think we need to be a little more delicate. Okay. Like, for example, if I don't know how to say this, we have to kind of tell the difference. You know what I mean? Like, you have to be able to know when you're putting a screen on reality and you're kind of almost complicating reality, and you're not really dealing directly with things that are true around you. Okay. That are true around you. Okay. So we have to kind of know the difference. But let's say if I'm making a value judgment, okay, if I'm making, like, say, if I'm assessing a situation, okay, and I'm making an assessment, okay, there are a lot of factors in how I place importance and how I judge the severity of issues, okay, that require judgment, okay. And those things, there's nothing in our objective position where we can just automatically have full authority in how we estimate and process. You know what I mean? So, like, say, if I have a child, okay, and that child is having a problem with masturbation and dishonesty, okay, like, okay, I can be very clear. Okay, masturbation is happening. Okay, dishonesty is happening. This is my child. I think he's too young, blah, blah, blah. Okay, the facts are the facts. Okay, I get that. The facts are the facts. But then how we estimate and how we assess the problem, how severe is this? Is this a sex addiction? Is my child becoming a serial killer? Are these just technical sins? Are these things that we can work out over time? You know what I mean? Those are the areas where you can't just look at something and just have the answer. Okay. That takes interpretation, judgment, and it takes kind of reflection. All right. And so I think that something like objectivism, like, say, Ayn Rand objectivism, basically this idea that, how I perceive things, without, let's say, the distortion of my denial mechanisms and all that. Okay, that's okay just to assess facts. Okay, just to assess, okay, what are the facts? But then as we process to assess, to determine what the facts are. Okay, but then assessing the facts, okay, assessing how important they are, and then how we're going to develop, let's say, a strategy for addressing them. Those things are matters of judgment that involve a lot of reflection, and you can't just immediately look at something and know how important it is and have perspective about it. Okay, so I think that when we look at the JODI HILDEBRANDT, okay, basically, I think her model is very similar to Ayn Rand in the sense that she has the idea that if you just take away the distortion, whatever the distortions are, and you just see things as they are, okay, basically you're in truth, okay. But I think she's avoiding the further complication that you can know the basic facts around you, and you can have the guts to see things that are not pleasant, okay. But then how do you assess them? How do you determine, how really important they are, and what is the best way to deal with them? Okay, those are things that require a lot of reflection and judgment. And it's not enough just to take away the screen. It's not enough to take away the screen of, let's say, our denial mechanisms or the mechanisms we have to complicate things or not face things. Okay, once we actually take away the screens, okay, and we actually do face things as unpleasant as they are, the next step is that really complicated step of assessing the importance, is assessing the severity and being realistic about it, and then coming up with a realistic way to deal with it. All right. And I think that is the part where I think JODI Hildebrandt and Ayn Rand, let's say, where their philosophies kind of don't stand up, they kind of collapse, because they're operating at the basic level of just assessing what is happening, okay, but they're not going deeper into the next step, which is how you assess and how you make let's say, a reasonable judgment about things and determine how to deal with them. Okay, that takes a little bit more sophistication. And in my opinion, this idea of avoiding all distortion, that actually I think is a bad device, because in a way I think we're going to interpret that as saying we don't want to deal with ugly, messy things. We like things that are simple and non-contradictory. Even Ayn Rand said that. She said non-contradiction. Things are what they are, and they are not what they're not. You know what I mean? But the fact is that in our world of subjective predicament, okay, we are always sort of in a place where how would you say, like, we are always living in a world where we have our own, let's say, experience and our own way of assessing things. And we're always dealing with other people and other situations and other possibilities around us, okay, that are like alternatives to the way we're thinking, okay? Not necessarily in terms of what is the facts, okay, but sort of how do you interpret the facts, okay? Now, for example, I'll give you guys a good example, okay? I was growing a plant a few months ago, okay, and I was sure just by the shape of the leaves, okay, that and just the way it was growing, I was sure that it was a green pepper plant. Okay, I was sure of it. All right, and it looked really like a green pepper plant, but it did strike me as strange that the leaves were so big. The leaves are really big, but I thought, well, that's just because I put them in the shadows, and maybe it's the soil I'm using. And when you grow plants in the shadow, and also the weather was kind of cool. When it's cool weather and you have a lot of shadow, sometimes the leaves grow bigger. So I really still believed it was a green pepper plant. And here, what would Ayn Rand say? I mean, I could see the leaves, I could see the plant. But diagnosing what type of plant it is, okay, that can be a little bit ambiguous, because a lot of different plants sort of look the same when they're young, okay? And as the plant started growing and growing, okay, it still looked like a pepper plant, but I thought, man, this is a super duper pepper plant. This is like on steroids, maybe this is a different variety or whatever. But a person who didn't know anything about this plant, they just looked at it for 1 second and they said, oh, they said it in Spanish, but basically they said that's a tamarillo. They use the Spanish word for tamarillo, but she said, oh, that's a tamarillo plant. And basically tamarillo is something you'll see like in Australia and South America. It's sort of like grows almost to the size of a big tree, like a small tree, like a big bush or a small tree. And it has these egg-shaped fruits that are like tomatoes, but they're sort of sweet, like sweet tomatoes. Okay, they're called tamarillos. But anyway, I looked at the plant and I was like, oh my God, it took me a while because I was so attached to it being a green pepper. And I'm looking at it directly. I'm not using any distortion. I'm just seeing it and making my assessment. You see what I mean? My diagnosis, you know what I mean? Or like, say, if you have chest pains, it's like you have exactly the pains of a heart attack. Even your heart is beating funny, but it turns out you have an irritation in your esophagus, which causes your heart to beat funny, because when you have the irritation, that irritation gets into the nerves and it makes your heart beat funny, but you could think you're having a heart attack. You might even have a radial pain in your arms, but that's just because you have pain in that core bundle of nerves in the thorax. You know what I mean? So it's like you could be so sure, and you could even have trouble breathing, and you could have all the symptoms of a heart attack, and it's like you don't have a heart attack. You have an esophagus, but until you believe it, you're really going to think you have heart problems. You know what I mean? So like, this is the thing. The subjective, we can never fully understand the depths of our subjective predicament. Okay. And it's not a distortion. It's not that you're in a distortion. It's just that everybody has, let's say, the fact of their subjectivity, which is that maybe you're not considering all the possibilities. Okay. And that's not distortion. That's just the fact that there's limitation in what we can process from one position. All right. And you have to sort of realize that, when I started, when somebody told me that my plant was actually a tamarillo, it took me a few days. And then finally I could see, and I was like, oh my God, that's a tamarillo. And then I could never see it again as a pepper plant. Like if I look at it now, it would seem crazy to look at it as a green pepper plant. And it doesn't even look like a green pepper plant now, but it hasn't changed. It's just that I realized, and it's like, wow, everything changed. It was like a total change of perspective, And so basically, I think, how would I say? I think just the model of truth versus distortion. I think that's a false binary. Okay, it's a false binary. Okay, there's another. It's like you think there's two prongs. There's really a third prong. You see what I mean? It's not this. It's this. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, there's like, say, clear perception, which is not truth. It's just clear perception. There's distorted perception of just what is, and then how we assess what's around us. Okay, and that has a subjective limitation, right? Because there may be other ways to assess that we're not considering or haven't occurred to us, things that we don't even know that we don't know, unknown unknowns. You know what I mean? Things that we don't even know that we don't know. Okay. And I think that that's almost like the gateway, to having a more open-minded approach to things. Okay. And so I think that what I see with JODI Hildebrandt is that she is almost like she's not even really aware or doesn't fully appreciate the subjective element, that it's not enough just to take away your distortions. Okay. That's just not enough. That you have to go a step further. And then funnily enough, when you go the step further, you actually have to take on all the dissonance. You have to take on all the incompatible, incongruous subject matter when you go outside of how you're used to thinking. Okay. And so now you're in the world where everything's conflicting and everything's incongruous and dissonant to the way you're used to thinking. Okay. And I think that's exactly what JODI Hildebrandt does not want to have, because she thinks that's distortion. Okay. So in a sense, I think that she proposes something, but I don't think she lives up to it because she hasn't addressed fully the more messy realities of what truth really is. Okay. Truth is not just undistorted perception. Okay. I think she needs to change her definitions and say, okay, we should strive for undistorted perception. Okay. Yes, we should try to be less distorted in our perception, because it is true. People do have denial mechanisms. People do have avoidant mechanisms. People have obfuscation mechanisms because they don't want to deal with unpleasant things. Okay. But when you have an unpleasant thing and you've taken away the veil, so to speak, to have more undistorted perception of what is happening, okay, then the next step is, how do you evaluate it? How do you diagnose it? How do you come up with a reasonable way to deal with it? Okay. And at that level, I think we have to reinvite sort of distortion, if you want to say, or turbulence. We have to sort of extend ourselves outside from how we're used to thinking, and really consider what is the full environmental situation to make an assessment. Okay. So that, we ought to not be satisfied that just because I have my history and my way of looking at things, just like I said with my pepper plant, I had a prejudice that actually distorted me, if you want to say, and so, like, in a sense, for me to have like a more mature way of diagnosing things, I need to always think like, well, maybe the way I'm looking, maybe there are things that I don't realize. Maybe there are ways of looking at this problem that I'm not even aware of that could help make a more mature assessment. I mean, I feel sorry if there's a parent, I feel sorry for parents. Like, say, if you have a child who's 13 or 14 years old and you find out he's masturbating, okay, whatever. And if you come from one of these cultures where you've been raised all your life to think that it's a mortal sin, to touch yourself, whatever, And I'm not even saying it's great to masturbate. I'm not one of these people who really cares. I don't see what's so wonderful about masturbation, to be quite honest. I'll be honest. I think in a way, I think it's kind of immature, but here's the thing. I don't think it's that big of a deal. Or if it is an issue, it's something that can be dealt with without making, I don't know how to say, like, not not treating it as a severe problem. You know what I mean? But if you come from one of these religions where you've been taught your whole life that that's like a terrible sin, I understand. I feel bad for those parents because they don't have the resources to understand that maybe it's not as serious as they think, and that even if it is an issue, there's ways to deal with it that don't have to be so catastrophic. Basically, you know what I mean? So in a sense, I think that kind of catastrophic assessment, okay, is to me a sign that even though they may have, let's say, a clear perception of the problem, okay, what they don't have is a mature assessment, or I should say a mature, okay, even though they have a clear perception of the problem, perception versus assessment. They don't have a mature assessment of the issue, okay? Because they're sort of stuck in their own prejudices and their own personal experience, and they're not inviting in maybe a broader, richer richer, how would you say, like a richer constellation of other points of view and ways to look at it, to have a little more perspective, okay? And I don't know. I guess I just think that, and that gets to the question of what is truth? What is truth? Because truth, inevitably, if one comes to believe that we all have a subjective limitation, okay, we do have to kind of get out of ourselves and sort of look at other ways, consider other ways of looking at a problem to get a richer sort of fidelity in how we assess a fact or assess a perception. And so basically, I mean, and this is exactly what a Mormon person like JODI HILDEBRANDT is not going to believe, because you're raised to think that anything outside the church is contaminated, basically. And so I think this is like a house of cards that'll never stand, because they already at the base of JODI HILDEBRANDT is this kind of unspoken prejudice that if she were to get outside of herself and have a more worldly perspective on things, she would actually be inviting in the contaminations of the inferior ways of thinking, that only the Mormon church is true. And so she's already set herself up to fail. Because if you really take that literally, and you really think that only in the Mormon world and the Mormon perspective are things actually true, then you're actually dooming yourself, because you're saying that basically, I don't want to go outside and have other perspectives. I don't want whoever told me that I have a tamarillo plant instead of a pepper plant. I don't want to hear that, because that comes from a bad source. Well, then I'm just going to keep thinking it's a pepper plant, and it never will be. And at some point it'll dawn on me. But talk about a distortion, but that's a different level of distortion. That's the distortion of subjectivity, which is not the same thing as having, like, say, clear perception. Okay. So I just think that, I think that in a way, I think JODI HILDEBRANDT is sort of doomed to fail, just because I think she takes very seriously sort of the Mormon ethos, which is this idea that outside the Mormon church, the perspectives are not really reliable. They're not really valid. And so she's already set herself up not to really consider things outside of her prejudices, basically. So even if she has a clear perception of what's going on around her, her assessments are probably not very stable and probably overly catastrophic, just because she doesn't have the benefit of a more, I don't know, a less prejudiced way of looking and assessing things around her. So, this idea of like having, like, say, righteous anger or like pure anger, whatever. I don't know. I guess I just think that I don't think she, how would you say? I think she knows that there is a bad anger out there, but I don't think she understands that her anger might be bad in the sense that she hasn't really learned to live outside of her world of prejudices, basically. So anyway, I know what I've said is a little bit complicated, and I could do a better job. But basically, I just think we need to distinguish between, clear perception and what it means to assess something, the judgment required to assess. And that requires getting out of our subjective predicament. And so I think that's where the problem comes with people who get a little bit too into what I would call religious narcissism. So anyway, thanks for your patience and thanks for watching.